one of the most dramatic dogfights of World War II. Bud Anderson and his P-51 Old Crow against a skilled German ace in a 109. Now recreated in stunning realism with real gun camera footage. Let's relive the greatest dogfight of America's last living triple ace, as well as his final missions in World War II. It is now May of 1944. Captain Bud Anderson has just become an ace, scoring his 5th confirmed kill after shooting down a Messerschmitt 109 just a few days prior. But there is little time to celebrate such milestones. In the 357th Fighter Group and across the Allied forces in England, the most crucial moment of the war is approaching: Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, France. This approaching operation would require major support from the flyboys of the 8th Air Force, flyboys like Captain Anderson. Their job, above all else, was to safely escort the American bombers as they attempted to pound German strongholds and protect the way for the troops on the ground. This was no easy task, however, as the Luftwaffe knew this all too well and adjusted their strategy accordingly, making sure to attack in an organized manner that would inflict the most damage possible on the bomber formations.
It seemed we were always outnumbered. We had more fighters than they did, but what mattered was how many they could put up in one area. They would concentrate in huge numbers, by the hundreds at times. They would assemble way up ahead, pick a section of the bomber formation, and then come in head-on, their guns blazing, sometimes biting the bombers below us before we knew what was happening.
But by now, the Germans were beginning to feel the attrition of war, especially in their Air Force. Bud Anderson stated this well in his book To Fly and Fight.
Even in May, we were seeing a very mixed bag of Luftwaffe pilots, when we saw them at all. By the fall of 1944, the Germans were sending kids into combat with only 60 hours of flying time and as little as 20 in fighters. By comparison, by the time I saw combat, I'd had almost 900 hours. We had the oil, the planes, the pilots, and time on our side against men so well trained. These new German pilots were cannon fodder. We didn't know at the time how green some of them were, of course. We treated each of them with respect, as if he were the Red Baron. There were plenty of those as well. Germany's surviving old hands were splendid pilots, flying aircraft that were still more than adequate to push a Mustang right up to its limits.
Anderson was exactly right. There were many pilots who were green, but also many who were seasoned, still leading the attacks against the American bombers. And oftentimes, you never had any idea which one you were up against until the dogfight was over. So, when a pilot was in combat, each German adversary had to be treated as if he were the best pilot you had faced thus far. But if nothing else, Bud, like many of the other American pilots, had a great deal of confidence in their new aircraft, the P-51 Mustang. These differences in aircraft would play a crucial role in determining the victor in Bud's next dogfight, one that he would refer to as the most intense battle of his career. This would take place on May 27th of 1944. On this mission, as the 357th had just linked up with their assigned bombers, the radio began to come to life, and it sounded like this was no small attack.
Bandits, 11 o'clock. Blue leader, break left. Bandit on your tail, red 1.
The action was ahead and was quickly going to be right on top of them. Now, normally, the German fighters would try to avoid the Mustangs and other escorts. They did not particularly care for tangling with the fighters, as their primary target was the bombers. But today, things would be different. For one of the only times in Anderson's career, the Messerschmitts came after him. As Old Crow led their flight into a turn to begin to engage the bandits, one of Bud's men quickly called out, "Bogies 5 o'clock high." Sure enough, they were 4 specks behind. As they neared, it became clear that these were indeed hostile, 4 Messerschmitts that were beginning an attack run on their flight. Immediately, Old Crow and the Mustangs break and a turning fight ensues. 4 P-51s and 4 Messerschmitts turning to see who will live and who will die. And although in this dogfight the 109s originally had the height advantage, the Mustang was able to turn just a little quicker inside of the German fighter. And quickly the German pilots sense this. They pull off of the turn and straighten out, opting to try and escape the dogfight with their engines at full speed. But Anderson and his flight continue after them. Suddenly, as they are approaching the Germans, one of the 109s pulls off, leaving the other 3, likely setting up an attack. Anderson sends his element leader, Eddie Simpson, and his wingmen after them, while Old Crow and his wingmen continue after the other 3. In a few moments, Captain Bud Anderson has a shot, right at the trailing 109 from 6 o'clock. He fires. The rounds find the bandit and smoke pours out. The 109, interestingly, rolls onto its back, however, flying upside down for a few moments before Anderson fires again, this time landing hits and sending the German down, his 6th kill of the war. Here we can see some of the gun camera footage from this chase, with Anderson firing on the 109 from directly behind. In the next few seconds, his focus immediately shifts to the other 2 Germans still ahead. They are now aware that he is there, and Bud even remembers their aircraft slightly twitching, clearly indicating that the 2 German pilots are looking over their shoulders to try and see the situation behind them. After watching their trailing plane go down, the 2 remaining 109s immediately split, with the second one diving and trying to escape, but the leader quite the opposite. He opts to climb to the left, giving no indication that he wants to run. It is clear already that this is no green pilot, and he is not afraid of a dogfight. This one could be trouble. Bud once again describes this combat beautifully in his book.
We turn inside it, my wingman and I, still at long range, and he pulls round harder, passing in front of us right to left at an impossible angle. I want to swing in behind him, but I'm going too fast, and figure I would only go skidding on past. A Mustang at speed simply can't make a square corner, and in a dogfight you don't want to surrender your airspeed. I decided to overshoot him and climb. He reverses his turn, trying to fall in behind us. My wingman is vulnerable now. I tell Scarrow to break off, and he peels away. The German goes after him, and I go after the German, closing on his tail before he can close on my wingman. He sees me coming and dives away with me after him, then makes a climbing left turn. I go screaming by, pull up, and he's reversing his turn. Man, he can fly. And he comes crawling right up behind me, close enough that I can see him distinctly. He's bringing his nose up for a shot, and I haul back on the stick and climb even harder. I keep going up, and still up, because I'm out of alternatives.
Bud is now alone, with a very skilled 109 close behind on his tail. He has nowhere to go but up, and his fate will clearly be determined by which aircraft gives way first.
I'm a fallen down dead man, but not quite. I look back. I can see that he is shuddering on the verge of a stall. He hasn't been able to get his nose up enough, hasn't been able to bring that big gun to bear. Almost, but not quite. His nose begins dropping just as my airplane too begins shuddering. He stalls, a second or two before I stall. He drops away just before I do. Good old Mustang.
Suddenly, the Messerschmitt begins to shudder ever so slightly, and then she stalls. 2 seconds later, Old Crow also stalls and gives way. The trusty American P-51 had saved Anderson's life, but the dogfight wasn't over yet.
He is falling away now, and I flop the nose over and go after him hard. We are very high by this time, 6 miles and then some, and falling very, very fast. The Messerschmitt had a head start, plummeting out of my range, but I'm closing up quickly. Then he flattens out and comes around hard to the left and starts climbing again, as if he wants to come at me head on. Suddenly, we're right back where we started.
This German pilot clearly knows what he is doing. To beat this one, Bud is going to have to take some risks. That much is clear. So the Messerschmitt is coming around again, climbing hard to his left, and I've had about enough of this. My angle is a little bit better this time. So I roll the dice. Instead of cobbing it like before and sailing on by him, I decide to turn hard left inside him, knowing that if I lose speed and don't make it, I probably won't get home. I pull back on the throttle slightly, put down 10 degrees of flaps, and haul back on the stick just as hard as I can. And the nose begins coming up and around, slowly, slowly. Hot damn. I'm going to make it. I'm inside him, pulling my sights up to him. And the German pilot can see this. This time, it's the Messerschmitt that breaks away and goes zooming straight up, engine at maximum power, without much alternative. I come in with full power and follow him up, and the gap narrows swiftly. He is hanging by his prop, not quite vertically, and I am right there behind him. And it is terribly clear, having tested the theory less than a minute ago, that he is going to stall and fall away before I do. I have him. He must know that I have him. Old Crow indeed has him, right where he wants him. In a couple of seconds, the 109 stalls, and Bud pulls the trigger. The tracers fly, and the rounds rake the 109 across, sending smoke flying. In the actual gun camera footage from this chase, we can see the 109 going upwards, coming to a stall, and the 50 caliber rounds drilling the aircraft. In what seems like slow motion, the 109 stalls and falls out of the sky, with Anderson's P-51 right beside it. The Bandit goes straight down for 20,000 feet, before eventually exploding on the earth, Anderson's 7th confirmed kill. This German pilot would likely be the greatest adversary that he ever saw, a skilled German who met his end at the machine guns of Old Crow. In many ways, it was not even Anderson that won the fight, but the P-51. It very easily could have been the other way around if one small thing had gone differently. But that's how it went. And as evening came on the 27th of May, Bud was simply happy to be alive. He had taken on a very skilled adversary and had made it out. You simply never knew what you were going to get in the summer of 1944. His very next mission would be clear evidence of that. This would take place on May 30th. During this mission, Bud and his flight were escorting over Germany, and here they spotted a large flight of 109s preparing to pounce on the bombers. Immediately, they dove in, and very soon it became clear that Bud's target was no ace, and likely he did not have very much experience at all. As Anderson led the attack into the group of Messerschmitts, he opened fire on the trailing aircraft, and almost immediately the pilot turned and dove away. He was either told by his leader to lead the Mustangs away, or possibly he panicked. Either way, it was clear from his actions that this pilot wasn't the best the Germans had to offer, flying in the trailing position and leaving his formation. The green German continued and dove towards the ground, trying to escape. But 25,000 feet later, he ran out of sky and had nowhere to go. Here, Anderson pulled up behind and prepared to fire, when suddenly the German took care of his own demise. Likely scared to death and trying to look over his shoulder, the green pilot pushed the stick forward, probably by mistake while trying to look backwards. This caused the aircraft to go slightly nose down, where he impacted the ground at full speed and exploded instantly. Here we can see the gun camera footage again from this victory. Because Bud did not actually fire a shot before the German went down, we do not have the explosion on camera. However, Bud does pull the trigger briefly here, making sure that his camera records the 109 clearly on fire on the ground. Now, interestingly, Bud also remembers some very specific details about this victory.
This, I remember in slow motion, stop action. There was a farmer driving a horse and wagon on the road just ahead, moving right to left, and the fighter crashed right behind him, just short of the road. The fireball with its great burning chunks of wreckage burst across the road where the wagon had been seconds earlier. The horse spooked, reared up, pawed at the air. I can close my eyes even now and see the poor farmer's face.
Now, I have tried very hard to enhance this footage and locate the horse or wagon, but the explosion is fairly far ahead and the footage in 1944 was not quite high resolution. Perhaps you can locate it, but regardless, I'm sure he's down there somewhere, frozen in time and scared for his life. As he eventually returned to base, Bud Anderson had now scored his 8th confirmed kill. The legend of Old Crow continued to grow. But his next kill would have to wait. For the next month, things changed. Something big was clearly coming, and that something would be D-Day. On June 5th, the unit was grounded and all aircraft were painted with the famous black and white invasion stripes to keep friendly fire at a minimum. In addition to this new paint job, a new strategy came about as well. Instead of long-range escort missions, most of the action was low-level patrol and support, with dive bombing included here as well. We can see some of Bud's gun camera footage from June of 1944 in the days following D-Day, where Old Crow and the Yoxford boys pounded ground targets and strafed anything German that they could find to try and pave the way for the boys on the ground. This was an important job and aided the Allied forces greatly, but like any fighter pilot, he thirsted for another dogfight. The next major escort mission for Bud would come on June 29th, and this would be one of the most significant in his tour of duty. During this mission, the P-51s were nearing the target and above the bombers, when a gaggle of Focke-Wulf 190s passed directly below them. Unfortunately for the Germans, they had never seen Old Crow and the other Mustangs. Quickly, Anderson pushed the stick down and began to approach the bandits, lining up the leader and opening up with his Browning 50 calibers. With a perfect shot, he hit this Focke-Wulf and the pilot quickly bailed out. This scattered the rest of the Germans, and Bud picked one more and went in after him. This 190 dove into some clouds, and Bud followed. The 190 likely thought that he was safe here and invisible to his adversary, but he was mistaken.
The others dove into a thin cloud to escape, and they were so thin that I merely followed this guy for a while. I could see him going through the clouds and slid underneath him and fired a short few bursts, and it's such an easy shot. I was close.
By the time the 190 and P-51 exited the cloud, Old Crow was right where she needed to be, at point-blank range and directly behind. Bud again pulled the trigger and opened fire. Bullets struck the enemy aircraft and it went down in flames.
Pulled the canopy, went off, and so I knew he was giving up and going to bail out. So I pulled up where I could just see him. I could watch him. Yeah, he had been injured because he was moving. I was watching him bail out. But as soon as the canopy left, the flame came boom in the whole cockpit. And then it started to burn around the cockpit area, and he actually settled back down into the cockpit, and that finished him for sure.
With 2 kills already and some ammunition still remaining, the fight wasn't over. On his way back to the formation, Bud spotted one more exposed German. For the 3rd time in this mission, he fired upon a Focke-Wulf 190, and for the 3rd time, she went down, with this pilot not getting out. A few hours later, Bud would arrive back in England, with 3 more kills now to be added to his tally. It was his best mission so far, and his tally would be raised to 11, a double ace. Bud would tally 1 more kill on July 7th. Another 109 that left itself exposed, likely a green pilot. This would bring his total tally to 12 1/4 on the war. His close friend and wingman on many of his earlier missions, Eddie Simpson, scored a kill on this date as well. Eddie was one of the guys that had been with Bud for a long time. He and Jim Browning. They were, without a doubt, Bud Anderson's closest friends. So, as one can imagine, 2 missions later, when Bud officially became the first of the originals in the 357th to finish his tour with 300 combat hours flown, it was a somber moment. In a couple of days, and after a long boat ride, he was stateside, where he would get a much-needed break, and he was treated like a hero back home. Unfortunately, this happiness would not last. Just a couple of weeks after Bud left England, Eddie Simpson was on a mission over France when his flight was jumped by a group of German fighters. In the ensuing action, Simpson collided with a friendly Mustang. He was, however, able to bail out and survived, but 4 days later he would be gunned down by German soldiers. It was a crippling blow to Bud. Immediately after learning about this, he had to board his ship back to England, heading back to complete a second tour. Upon arriving back to his base in England, he was given a new model of the P-51, the D model. This one had 6 machine guns instead of 4, and the new bubble canopy. Appropriately, Bud quickly had this one painted again with the famous words, "Old Crow." His first major action of this second tour would take place on November 27th. Now, while the Germans were on their heels at this point, they were very far from defeated. The Luftwaffe was still coming up in force, and in many ways was now more motivated than ever, as most of the bombing raids were now in the midst of their homeland. On this day, however, the 8th Air Force decided to try a new and bold strategy. On this mission, there were no bombers. Instead, simply a massive force of Mustangs that were sent to try and lure the Germans up, hoping to easily eliminate them in a massive dogfight. To do this, they had one group of Mustangs fly like the normal escorts, and the rest fly in a bomber-style formation, a combat box to try and fool the Germans into thinking that this was a normal raid. The plan worked almost too well. The Germans responded with an absolutely massive amount of fighters, pushing more than 100. One can only imagine their surprise when they realized that they were coming in on Mustangs, not bombers, and that they would have to fight their way out of this one. The bandits dove in, and today they were Focke-Wulfs, and more than could be counted. Old Crow and the Mustangs engaged. Quickly, Bud got onto the tail of one of the Germans and opened up. The 190 eventually stopped moving and slowly turned away, the pilot almost certainly dead at the controls. With no time to watch, Bud turned and looked for another. He found it and pulled the trigger again to drill a second lone German, which turned away smoking. Still, however, there was a dogfight underway and no time to confirm the kills. So Bud pushed the stick and began to keep looking for more targets. A few moments later, now at a lower altitude, they found them. This time, however, they were two 190s, and Bud quickly realized that they were on final approach to land. Bud and his wingman dove in after them, but the intelligent German pilots realized that they had no chance. So instead, they opted to bring their planes in for a quick belly landing, giving themselves a chance to fight another day rather than being shot down and killed by the Mustangs. Shortly thereafter, Old Crow and the rest of the flight would turn for home. The claims after this mission were complicated, with plenty of action to go around. In the end, Captain Anderson would claim 3 destroyed, but would receive credit for 2 and 1 probable, raising his total to 14, 1 short of a triple ace. A week later, on December 5th of 1944, one last major aerial battle took place. In this mission, Bud and his flight actually had to leave the main formation, as one of the pilots in their group got sick at high altitude. Incidentally, this brought them down right to where the Germans would be. In this scrap, Bud would have one final big day, destroying 2 more 190s in a tangle over Berlin itself. Now at 16 kills, Captain Bud Anderson was a triple ace plus 1. For the next few weeks, both sides would fly very little, as the winter brought about bad weather. Captain Bud Anderson was promoted to major, and he flew a handful of additional missions, but he would not find himself in another major scrap. In his overall combat tours over Europe, Bud Anderson flew 116 missions, scored 16 1/4 kill, and never had to abort a single mission. He was also never hit by enemy aircraft. When Bud left Europe, however, his good friend and one of the other originals, Jim Browning, remained behind to finish out his tour. 1 month later, in February, Browning and a wingman got into a fight with 2 German jets, Messerschmitt Me-262s. During this dogfight, Browning's leader went after one and he the other. After his leader shot his Messerschmitt down, he turned and looked for Jim, who was nowhere to be found. He vanished and would be listed as missing in action. Following the war, Bud had a son and a daughter. He named his son James Edward Anderson, after Eddie and Jim, his closest friends in the 357th, who were both killed in action over Europe. Many years later, Bud's son Jim would travel to Europe and help locate the wreckage of Jim Browning's Mustang, confirming the theory that he likely collided with the 262. In the years following World War II, Anderson became a test pilot and served in many different roles for the United States Air Force. He retired in 1972. In 2022, Bud Anderson turned 100 years old and was promoted to Brigadier General by the United States Air Force. Through him, his family, and his book, To Fly and Fight, the story of Old Crow lives on, and will hopefully never die. Making these videos takes countless hours of research, editing, and recording. If you want us to be able to continue to make them, click right here to help save history by joining our Patreon. If you know a living veteran of the air war, please fill out the form in the description so we might be able to tell their story. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time.